Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we dive into our second session of our Parenting Roadmap series that deals with building responsibility. This particular roadmap is intended for parents who have kids ages 6 through 10, and we're really glad that you've joined us tonight. If you want to catch up with last week, if you missed us, it'll be available as well, so you can go back to part 1 or join us tonight for part 2. And the material for this particular roadmap is available on the roadfm.org. You can click on the Parenting Roadmap icon and go down to the Building Responsibility topic, and there you'll see kind of the material that we're using as a launching point for this particular conversation, and we would love to engage with your questions. And so if you have any questions, you can email those to Matt at ccmcdermott.org, and we're going to spend our third session trying to answer those questions and to interact with your questions as a group. Again, I'm joined by the Strothers and the Kinsfathers, and we're really excited about diving into kind of a difficult topic tonight about discipline, but as Scripture shows us, this is really an important topic, and this is a topic that is connected to love, and discipline and love go hand in hand. And so kind of to set the tone for our discussion about the intersection of discipline and love, we're going to be reading from Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to read verses 6 through 11. And this particular passage really speaks to the love that God has for us and how that manifests itself in discipline. So Hebrews 12, starting in verse 6. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which we have all participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the very moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So that really speaks to the love that God has for us and the opportunity that we have as earthly parents to participate in that showing of love through discipline. And I know we all love what it yields. It yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. The peaceful fruit of righteousness is the result of the discipline that God gives us. And so that really sets the terms for thinking about our role as parents as we think about discipline. And so when we think about discipline and discipleship, and we talked a little bit about this in session 1, how do we connect the two as we think about our role as parents?
One of the things to think about is that when we hear the word discipline, we immediately think punishment. And that's not necessarily true. Often, discipline is just correction. It's, hey, you may be able to do this a little better. Let's look at how you did it and think about how can we do it better the next time. We certainly get that when we think about coaches, and the coach is trying to help you be better every time you do the thing over again. So it doesn't have to be punishment. Sometimes it is. And we have to decide what types of punishment we mete out. And that's a decision that spouses are going to have to work out together. Ruth Ann and I are older. We did spank our kids when they were young. You may or may not do that. That will be up to you to decide. But we also used a lot of other forms of punishment. There were timeouts. There were other things that we did.
Well, each child's different. We've talked about that before with personality. One of our children, just a look was all it took. The corporal punishment wasn't necessary. Just the fact that mom was sad or disapproved of what the action was, and that corrected it. But if both parents don't agree and one's too lax and one's too harsh, then children also, I think, they learn to play on that. And they'll go to their soft parent to get what they want. And so I think you set yourself up for more problems if you're not in agreement.
I think that's a really great distinction, that discipline isn't always about punishment. And, discipline and disciple, they obviously share some etymology. I mean, they've got to be from the same root word. And they really come from words that mean to follow and to learn. And so it's more about the learning experience. And if we think about those two words being connected all the time, it really helps us stay grounded in our goals, our long-term goals for parenting, and just remembering that these little mistakes and how we react to them will really impact those long-term goals for character development and helping to raise Christ followers instead of just kids that don't make mistakes. So.
It just, as much as possible, it's nice to let them have some natural consequences, that it doesn't necessarily have to be what punishment we might mete out, but just whatever the result is of their action, they have to live with that. And I think that's a good rule for life, that us as adults, we have to live with the result of whatever poor choices that we make. And whenever kids can do that kind of in a safe environment at home, it's a good place for them to make their mistakes before the consequences are too high.
And the kids are also going to know somewhat what the reactions are going to be. Our kids knew who was going to be loud and who wasn't necessarily going to be loud. They know that, don't they? They know. And so if I got loud, they knew, okay, I need to shape up now.
Another just sort of big picture part of discipline I'm starting to understand more with our kids as they're becoming more self-aware is just how connected discipline from us as parents is connected to our children's self-esteem. That came across to us very, very just specifically when our oldest was working on a project for school where he had to do a TED Talk. And he did a TED Talk about self-esteem and the problems of low self-esteem. Now, that's pretty amazing for a fifth grader to talk about. But it was also very eye-opening for us, and just hearing him talk about how discipline and making mistakes and punishment and those sort of things were the things he was talking about impacting self-esteem. And I read recently something about the difference between guilt and shame. And seeing his discussion about self-esteem really made me think about that, about how guilt is your reaction when you realize you've done something wrong, but shame is when you feel like you are bad for what you did. And I think it's really important that we help our kids to understand the difference, that what you did was a mistake, you messed up, but that doesn't make you a bad person. You are guilty of this, and you should feel bad about it. That's actually a good thing that you feel bad about it, but you shouldn't feel bad about yourself because you made mistakes. So talking through some of those things with kids, even with fifth graders, apparently, even at school, they're talking about it. So we definitely should be talking about it with them at home.
There's so many good things in those introductory remarks. I want to follow up on a couple of them. You both have multiple kids, and in that you've identified how you may have to speak to them differently or correct them differently or whatever. How do you go about when one kid may see a certain kid being corrected one way and them being corrected another way? Or how do you go about kind of managing how you want to be unique to each kid, but everybody's watching? So how do you walk through that?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember if that ever seemed to be an issue.
Me and my brother are 19 months apart. That was a big issue at our house.
Well, I think that has to do with how you define fairness. Some people and kids, they're so, tangible. I mean, everything is very physical and just black or white and right or wrong and all of that. They tend to think that fairness means everybody gets exactly the same. But if you can help your kids understand that fairness is really giving people what they need when they need it, then I think that some of that, it's not going to be always balancing and playing off of each other and having to equalize things a little bit.
It's just a small detail, but I think having a boy and a girl makes it a little bit easier for us, that they expect different things. I could see brothers, it's got to kind of match more closely. But again, I think it really would differ by family, but there is some level of explanation that like you said, if you giving them what they need when they need it, and just having it's got to be negotiable, that you provide the discipline that they need at the right time, or the encouragement that they need at the right time, and they have to trust you a little bit to know what is appropriate.
And sometimes, I grew up in a family of 3 boys, and there were times when I got punished for something that one of my brothers did, and you may get reminded of that later. I'm liable to remind my mother of that now, that I got punished for whatever my younger brother did. So, we also have to be willing to apologize and go back and say, okay, I did that wrong. I'm sorry.
Our boys were very different. One was very loud and bubbly and outgoing at this age, and the other was quiet, much quieter. And so their punishments were different. And we kind of talked about the quieter one. I used to pray, dear Lord, let me catch him doing something wrong, because he always seemed to be doing everything right. So yeah, how we punished sometimes was different. And at times we did lump them together when it was probably just one of them. And, but I don't remember them throwing that in our face. I can't remember.
When we think about, follow through and consistency, I think, maybe not as much with this age, but they're watching too. We live in a world where kind of getting out of things is kind of almost being placed as a good thing sometimes. So, I mean, how do we, teach our kids that, you talked about natural consequences. There are consequences for certain things. How do we teach that it's ultimately kind of helpful to us to experience some of those consequences?
Well, it's very important to be consistent with the consequences. If you may have a child who's inherently funny. Well, that doesn't mean just because they did something that was funny that they get away with it and that there's no consequences. We may still have to follow up with consequences after laughing, maybe with them, but they still get in trouble because what they did was still wrong and they need to be corrected for it.
And we talked a little bit last time, but just having time to pause before reacting. I think that's just such a big part of that part of consistency, honestly, that just because you're in a bad mood that day, you don't overreact because of the same thing they did yesterday, that it wasn't that big a deal yesterday. And if you can kind of take a break, take a breath, take time to respond the way that you really want to respond, not the way that your impulse causes you to respond, that will help them feel the consistency and experience it. And on one hand, know that you're always going to follow through the same way, but just on the other hand, it helps them kind of get that boundary of when they went too far or when they did something that they do better than.
And that taking a pause before reacting is something that Jaron and I really have to help each other with. We will find ourselves reacting to the kids, and then, I mean, you mentioned about one of your kids knowing the look. Sometimes he'll give me the look and be like, okay, I need to stop what I'm saying right now and think through it before I finish reacting to the situation. Or I'll do the same for him and just kind of take a beat and take a step back and remember But what we're remembering are things that we've talked about proactively, that we've talked about how we want to react to the kids. And we may be talking about that in reference, reacting to something else, but it still is a proactive conversation talking about how do we want to discipline or react to and try to help our kids learn in those situations. So we've talked through that proactively, and then we discuss things reactively too. We try to not make a disciplined decision too quickly without discussing it together. So you definitely, when something's going wrong, you have to stop the behavior. You need to talk about, identify that problem that's happening, but you can wait to really respond to it. And you might say that I'm going to talk with your dad about this, and we're going to discuss together what's going to happen. But you do have to stop the behavior, but you don't have to make your decision right there.
But I also think, Mikey, that goes along with that, we have to be careful to not always lead the discipline to just one parent.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
for sure.
I think that sometimes in some families that can become a problem if we do that.
Sure. Yeah.
I think one thing that, we've kind of been talking around in many ways is, much of the discipline follows the same principles that, we all experienced when we were being disciplined, but they may come in different forms, right? I mean, kids are different in some ways today. They're the same in some ways today, but I think we just need to be really intentional about the why behind what we're doing. I know when we lied, we got our mouths washed with soap or whatever. That might not be what you did at your home today. It might be, but the principle behind what we did was the same, right? So being intentional about those things is really important. When we think about conflict, oftentimes when we're issuing discipline, this can become a point of conflict. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but oftentimes it is. And so, we have to understand ourselves and how we respond to conflict. What are some things that you think are important to think about kind of in those moments in which we may have started out in a particular situation, but it's escalated to maybe a point of conflict in either your eye or the kid's eye, or maybe in both of your eyes? How do we deal with those types of conflicts?
One thing that we've learned, that it's important to avoid saying always or never, to not take the action to an extreme to say you always do this or you never do that. And that I've messed up on that plenty of times. And you can kind of see it in the kids' reaction, that it hurts their self-esteem. It hurts their pride, that they think you think that they're failing or just always doing it wrong. And so I try to just take that out of my vocabulary, that I'm not going to say always, I'm not going to say never. I'm going to have a more measured reaction and kind of use the appropriate words for whatever's going on at the time, and not just avoid these blanket statements.
I think that we need to sometimes stop and pray with our children to say, this is a situation that let's talk to God and bring in the spiritual side of things, and everybody can pause. And you can have conflicts like that with children in this age group. It's also a time to teach them to say I'm sorry to each other. If it's two siblings maybe that's in a situation, conflict situation, after you've talked about it and what the consequences are, to teach them to say I'm sorry, to say I love you, to hug each other. I know two brothers sometimes in those situations may not want to do that, shake hands, but that's how you start teaching those kind of values to your children too.
And sometimes it takes us actively getting involved in the situation. There were times when a room needed to be cleaned up that both boys were in. And if we just said, go clean your room, one boy was going to do 80% of the work and the other was going to do 20. And we understood that. We knew that that was happening. But the only way to correct it is to get in there and to be present and to make sure that they're both working. Well, that means I have to quit doing what I'm doing and go be a part of that. Well, sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that's what we need to do. We need to go and be a part of getting things done and doing it fairly.
One particular resource that kind of first got popularized as a marriage book was the 5 love languages, but there is a 5 love languages for children as well, and that's where some of the material in the workbook comes from, and a lot of that speaks to, when your kid may be brought down from a particular interaction, how do you build them back up, and understanding kind of each one of your kids' love language, to use that term, can be really helpful in reinserting some of that esteem into our kids. So as we transition away from conflict itself, we kind of want to go one step deeper and talk about the misbehavior. And sometimes we got to go below the surface. Sometimes a particular behavior may be what it is at face value, but sometimes we might need to ask, hey, what's going on here? So what do you think about the question, why do children misbehave?
Well, I think there are just a ton of reasons why. Sometimes they're just being kids and they're getting in a hurry or being sloppy or moving too fast and make mistakes in that way. And I think when it's just kids being kids and getting in a hurry, not really intentionally making mistakes, I think natural consequences to what happened is really a good way to deal with that. But I think that we forget sometimes that there are a lot of times when kids misbehave because they really didn't know better. They really didn't understand the circumstances they were in and how their actions didn't fit with that. And I think just checking ourselves to see if that might be the reason, did they just really not know that they shouldn't have done what they did, and using that as a learning opportunity instead of a punishment opportunity, I think is important. But then there are other times when I think kids misbehave intentionally, and they know what they're doing and they do it wrong anyway, and that definitely requires some consequences and punishments. But I think as parents, we still have to look at the why behind that. Why were they intentionally doing something that was wrong or inappropriate? Were they just trying to get attention for some reason? Is something else going on that's bothering? Did they have a bad day or something? Or are they being selfish? Are they starting to have a tendency of something that's selfish or lazy, or something that we really need to work on that's deeper than that one misbehavior? But I think really, like you said, going deeper and thinking about the reasons for misbehavior helps us not just to understand what happened, but also to think about what is the most appropriate consequence for that.
That's good. And you're starting to see their personalities and their inner being develop even more through this stage of life. And one of our sons is just very, he was quieter. He kept things inside. He was not as verbal to tell us what was bothering him. So it took us, we had to delve into that. We had to try to ask more questions. He was sensitive, he was caring, but he didn't let those feelings always show. So sometimes when a behavior became present, it took time to find out really what's going on. Sometimes you have to spend the time to find out why.
Sometimes because of that personality, the behavior that happened was an explosion because he had been holding it in. And so then all of a sudden it goes from this level to this level, and we're going, what happened? And it had built up over some time, and we didn't really realize that. And you have to find that out, to say, well, why did this very large response happen? And let's figure this out and make sure that we don't let those things happen, let it just simmer and be held in for so long.
And I think one thing as well is this is New Year's resolution season. We see how hard habits are to develop, and we sometimes give ourselves a lot of grace. I know I do around this time of year about my bad habits, but it can take a while to develop these good habits in our kids as well. And that kind of goes to one thing from the Love and Logic book we want to just spend a second on is how do we see our kids' mistakes as opportunities instead of like, this thing that is the end of the world or this really bad thing that just happened. How do we take an opportunity mindset?
That's another one that we touched on a little bit in the previous session, but it's where the stakes are not so high when the kids are at your home. Letting them fail, letting them have those natural consequences, letting them just suffer whatever the repercussions of their actions are is a great way for them to learn a lesson. And it's hard to do that sometimes because it really might mean that the discipline or the punishment that you might want to mete out could take a few minutes, whereas this consequence could be hours or days, and it makes it harder to be the parent in those circumstances. But it's one of those times where just spending the extra time now will hopefully avoid that same behavior occurring in the future and instill a lesson that lasts a lot longer than whatever punishment you could have delivered would have lasted for them.
So as we think about, dealing with incidents or dealing with certain behaviors, a lot of times we have to step back to the systems level of what's really, going on in your home. What are some of the things that you've set up to create the type of environment that you're wanting to create, and kind of maybe the buzzword around that is boundaries, right? That's the word that we see thrown around a lot. But sometimes it's easier said than done. So when we think about what are some good boundaries, and maybe what are some good boundaries in particular for 6 through 10, what comes to mind when you think about some of those healthy boundaries?
Just one thing that we have, I think, good boundaries on is like technology, where our kids, they don't pick up their tablets or turn on the television without asking. That's always, they need permission in order to use technology. And we try to say yes as much as possible, but with a time limit. Like, sure, you can use your tablet, but set a timer for 20 minutes. Or, yeah, you can watch one episode. And they know that. So it's just an expectation every time that they're going to turn on the TV or pick up their tablet that they need permission, and there's a frame within which they can do it. And just, the way it's built in, there are some controls to, they know what they can do. They, at this point, haven't tried to do anything they couldn't do. That's kind of the next level of parenting. But those kind of simple boundaries around technology is one that's really helped us out so far.
I'll play contrarian for just a second. Jaron, say I'm the parent that hasn't had any technology boundaries to this point, and I really just like what you just said about the time limits, but I haven't been doing that. What do you think I should do now? You think I should give up or what?
Well, our kids learned the time limits and learned to ask for permission, because when they didn't, they lost their devices. And but we did that when they were really little, consistently enough that they remember it now, I think. And we do stick with that. If we catch them, and we do, and they're not perfect, just like we're not perfect parents, they're not perfect kids. But if we catch them using technology, and I'll say, did your dad give you permission for that? And they'll say, no, or maybe, I think he did. We'll confirm that. And then they've lost technology for the rest of the day or for tomorrow or something. And just being consistent with those consequences. I think that when we're talking about boundaries, what we're really talking about are expectations. And expectations are only as good as our consistency is. But we also have to clearly communicate to our kids those expectations. But kids really thrive on that structure. Just like little ones, when they were toddlers, did so much better when you were following your nap and sleep schedules. Kids that are this age do better if they're in a schedule and they're in a routine, or they have structure that they know is consistent. So I think that kids can be brought into that kind of a structure too with some practice.
And we also have to realize that our rules are very likely to be different from their friends' rules. And they're going to compare them, and they're going to feel like maybe it's not fair. But that's okay. We have our own rules in our family. Our technology when our kids were younger is very different than the technology is today, but we had very much rules about it. We had one computer in the house. It was in the family room. It was in the middle of everything. And
I had the password.
we had the passwords. And so
But
there
now
were
everybody
boundaries
has
about it.
tablets. Everybody has tablets, and they have them for school and phones, and it's a different challenge.
But maybe the cell phones are plugged in your room and left there when they have a phone, so that they don't have it all night long. And I
But
think,
hopefully these kids don't have a cell phone.
but a lot of them will
For sure.
already.
I will say grandparents can let their grandchildren watch more shows.
Well, I appreciate what you said, Steve, about the devices and where they're located at night, especially. I know from being around parents of teenagers and that sort of thing that a lot of them try to institute those rules of keeping the devices on a charging station or in the parents' room or that sort of thing. And I think if we start that now with our kids and they never have that expectation of having their tablets, even if it's only on, Amazon Playtime and it's really locked down, but we don't leave it in their room now, they're not going to have that expectation when they're in high school that they're going to have their phone with them all the time. So we're really setting up patterns now, hopefully, that will carry on later.
And this is one thing that, we've kind of introduced this a little bit too about the change, but for many of our parents, you guys are first generation at dealing with some of these technologies and first time dealing with some of these apps and different things that, you may say yes at first, but the more you find out about it, you may have to say no. And you might not have had time limits on this certain thing for a while, but you can start today. And, you got to give yourself some grace that we're still finding out the effects of some of these things, and we're not going to have the benefit of being the second group to go through it. You guys are the first group, and you got to give yourself some grace in some of that for sure.
And let them earn extra time. It can be a positive reinforcement as well.
Another thing you just made me think of along those lines is if where you can get involved, it will really help both you and them. Like Mikey has a Roblox account, so she can play with Jackson and learn about this environment that he's exploring. And he always wants us to play Minecraft. I need to learn how to play Minecraft, and he would love to show me his worlds, and it would help me to understand the risks that are out there. What are the things that could go wrong that I don't even know about? And so I haven't done this yet, but I would encourage any of you to get involved in the apps and the games that your kids are playing, just so you know what they're up to and the good and the bad.
And that gives us one of those opportunities for that interaction too, to where we can actually listen to what they want to tell us about what it is that they're doing. And if we are actively listening, then we can ask questions that reinforce that we're listening and that we want to hear what you're doing and what you like about this or what you don't like about this.
I love that, Steve. In fact, someone told us ages ago, if you listen to the little things, then they'll talk to you about the big things. So I feel like we're in the stage where we're trying to do that now and trying to listen to those little things that might be kind of annoying or we might not really be that interested in, but listen to them now and get and show interest in things that are important to them now so that they'll want to talk to us about those bigger, more important things later.
And I've heard you guys talk about this a lot about some of the creative ways you use the Alexa at y'all's house, right? Some certain things that, you can create some bonding around certain technology items and make them a rhythm of how you guys are, doing life as a family. And it's one of those, it's not all bad, it's not all good, it's discernment. And that's really what a lot of these boundaries are about. So we've talked about technology. Any other boundaries that we want to make sure and talk about?
Well, one of the things that I think you can do, this is also an age where you're letting your kids go over to someone else's house and be in another family environment, and you can set some boundaries around that. What times are appropriate to do that. We also had one that said if you get to someone's house and you're not comfortable there, it's always fine to call us and we will come and get you immediately, no questions asked. And we did that. So there were times when we got the phone call that said, things are not the way I like around here. And we'll be there in just a few minutes.
And that was great school. So they need to know that.
And I think, and I've heard this from both of you guys before, of creating your homes in a place to where your kids know they can have friends in your home as a safe and healthy place for them to be with their friends, for sure. When we think about, just touching briefly on kind of warning methods that come with boundaries, how do we go about what is appropriate as kind of some guardrails when our kids are approaching the boundaries?
Well, when I think about that with warning methods, I think back to when the kids were 2, and we would give them a countdown before we left the playground, or else there would be a meltdown. So you say, okay, we're going to leave in 2 minutes, and okay, now we're going to leave in 1 minute, and then they know. And if you're consistent with your countdown and you really keep it close to real time, then they get into a routine of that. And I think it still holds true for elementary kids too, that they appreciate a heads up when you're going to be changing, when you're moving to something else. If we didn't set a time limit on technology, but I feel like they've had too much, I'll say, okay, when you get to a stopping place in that game, you need to shut it down, or you have 5 more minutes and then you're going to shut it down, and giving them a little bit of margin before we cut something off. I think that's helpful. I think if there's like a repeated behavior or a place where boundaries are being kind of tested, you can set up a code word with your child to remind them that they're getting close to triggering a consequence or something. I think that can be helpful for some kids too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for being a part of these first 2 sessions, and we hope that if you guys have questions, that you're sending them over to Matt at ccmcdermott.org, and we will do our best to work through some of those questions in our next session. One other resource that I want to put in a plug for, and this is something I so appreciate our elders making a priority. We have a counselor on staff here at McDermott Road. Dave Stevens does an awesome job working with families and helping people think through some of these systems and ways to make their home a healthier place. And that's something that Dave can also point you to other resources in our area that would be beneficial. And so that's a great opportunity there. And if there is ever anything that we can do for you, we want to do that for you. And so we hope you will join us next week as we try to answer some of your questions and circle back to some of these important topics about building responsibility in our homes. So we hope that you have a great week.